This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. There are a few moments in history where a handful of decisions and just a little bit of luck can throw the entire balance of power in a continent one way or the other. One of those moments in particular happened just over 100 years ago. And before I go into it, see if any of this sounds familiar to you. At the end of the First World War, the entire continent of Europe was effectively thrown into chaos. But when looking at chaotic countries in particular, we would find ourselves looking upon the Russian Civil War. The two major factions of which being the Whites, being the Royalists, loyal to the Tsar and the European order, and the Reds, the Bolsheviks, seeking to establish a Soviet state. Now at the time, the Allies, particularly the French, British and Americans, were particularly open about the threat that this new communist force in the East could pose to the stability of Europe, and so took it seriously and sent in large amounts of weapons as well as some soldiers looking to back the Royalist factions. But then the Russian Civil War dragged on, and the Whites seemed to be losing. And within the Allies' political circles, the will to keep these efforts up seemed to just slowly evaporate. After all, it seemed like a lot of money, and Russia's far to the east, in no way a direct threat to Paris or Berlin. And due to a lack of political interests, the Allies abandoned the Whites, leaving them to their fate in the Russian Civil War. And as the pessimists had predicted, the Bolsheviks would eventually go on to win that war. Again, stop me if any of this is starting to sound familiar. Fast forward a few years now to 1920. And the Russian Civil War hasn't come to an end, but the Bolsheviks by now have effectively broken the abandoned Whites. And Moscow feels it's now ready to look westward for expansion, with its eyes now fixated upon the newly liberated states of the Baltics, Ukraine, and the re-emerged Polish Republic. And senior communists like Leon Trotsky touted that once the Bolsheviks had conquered Poland, then Germany would inevitably enter revolution, and the rest of the continent would then follow. Now, at the beginning of this conflict between the Soviets and the Poles, Warsaw would end up losing a number of the early battles, and by August, the Bolsheviks were now closing in on Warsaw itself. But then came our pivotal moment in history, as in August 1920, thanks to a broken Soviet radio, some bold strategy by the Polish generals, and just a pinch of luck here and there with the weather, the Poles pulled off what became known as the Miracle on the Vistula. They routed the Bolshevik forces back into Russia and secured their republic's freedom. And from that moment forward, the Soviets would move to a policy of socialism in one country, and away from the Trotskyist model of global revolution that seemed poised to flip nations like Germany. Now, had the Poles not won the Miracle on the Vistula, it's nowhere near certain that that's the way their history would have played out. But it is one of those interesting what-ifs that we could talk about for hours. Regardless of which way it goes, though, it is likely that we have Poland to thank for shielding those new states like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Lithuania from Moscow's westward expansion, even if those victories were unfortunately short-lived. But now with that scenario rattling in the back of your mind, fast forward 100 years to the present day, and Moscow is once again on the move westward, in fact fighting just a mere few hundred kilometers eastward of where that century-old Miracle on the Vistula took place. And once again, we see the Allies' political resolve and commitment to combating this westward march from Moscow seems to be beginning to waver, this time not for the Royalists, but instead for Ukraine. And Europe is seemingly once again looking to Poland as the potential eastern shield for the continent, with Poland now growing to one of, if not soon, the largest land power within the European Union. A somewhat understandable move, noting the fact that the Russians have large garrisons in Kaliningrad to the north, throughout its allies' territories in Belarus to the east, and the majority of Russia's best units currently sitting in Ukraine to the southeast. Europe, much like in 1920, is placing its bets on the Poles to be the bulwark against an expansion from Moscow, whether it be as a supplier of arms, a transit corridor into the battle itself, or a direct combatant against hybrid warfare seeping out of Russia and Belarus. Europe is becoming increasingly reliant on Poland defending the east of the continent, which is also somewhat rich, seeing as it was only just a couple of years ago that the EU was threatening to kick Poland out of the Union for moves it was making domestically, and that as recently as 2021, war games being conducted by the Poles were indicating that Poland would fall to Russia within just 5 days if Moscow decided to march westward. As the politics shows us, a lot has changed in Poland over the last few years, but as history shows us, a lot here in Poland has also depressingly stayed the same. So how did Poland reach this point? Why have they chosen to tie themselves to the South Koreans or their weapons to fight off Russia? Is the Poland of today the pushover that those war games suggested back in 2021? Or is it the nation that will once again dig in its heels and be the ones to prevent Moscow's westward expansion? Well, those are just some of the questions we're going to be answering here today. And to help us unpack how we got here, as well as how Poland found itself at the heart of the European economy and European defence plans, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. The Schengen Shields.
The election was a massive game changer. Donald Tusk was able to win the election and has now formed a government. He's a very big player in Brussels, not only because he's pro-European, but because he has a former role as European Council president. He's a known quantity to many leaders. And so what Tusk's election victory has done has effectively reinserted kind of Poland back into the European mainstream and given it a meaningful and pretty material platform in the EU and in Brussels.
Mujtaba Rahman is the managing director of the Eurasia Group, a European think tank specialising in the economics and finance of Europe and the EU. Prior to joining the Eurasia Group, Mujtaba worked at the European Commission's Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs and at the UK Treasury, as well as being a senior visiting fellow at the London School of Economics. So we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
And so now Poland is one of the countries to look to alongside France, Germany and others when thinking about or considering what the EU is likely to do on all of the challenges that it's facing and the things it does and the decisions it makes.
Now, we're having this discussion today coming off the back of a highly impactful election in Poland, where the Law and Justice Party, the PiS or PIS party, was swept out of power for the first time since 2015. Now, the PiS government had come under a lot of criticism over its 10-year term for its moves around curtailing media freedom and changing media laws in the country, some of its policies around civil liberties, and the country's controversial muzzle law, allowing the parliament to dismiss or cut salaries of judges who push back against the government's policies, with these moves being carried out under the justification that some of the older judges still in the Polish system are holdovers from the communist era, and therefore may not have the current Polish state's best interests in heart. Now, the European Union has been heavily criticising the Polish judicial reforms, warning that they violate the principles of judicial independence and even threaten Poland's EU membership, with the PiS party just ignoring these warnings and continuing to barrel down this path. And in retaliation, much of the EU's COVID recovery funds were actually withheld from Poland after the pandemic, with about 35 billion being withheld from Poland. Now, for outsiders who had been watching this for quite a long time, it really did seem that the two sides were destined for an all-out confrontation. But then Russia carried out its 2022 invasion of Ukraine, and at the time, everybody had bigger fish to fry. So everyone in Warsaw and the EU put most of these issues aside for the time being. After all, the EU was in no position to criticise Poland, as Poland had very quickly become one of the major suppliers of arms and equipment into Ukraine, and nearly 90% of all military resources entering Ukraine at some point were transiting through Poland. But as the war continued on and we got into 2023, the EU and Warsaw once again began to start criticising one another. Which brings us up to the October legislative elections, where the right-wing Law and Justice Party were narrowly defeated by the centre-right party Civic Platform, ushering in Donald Tusk as the new Prime Minister of Poland. And if that name sounds familiar to you, there is a good reason why. Tusk had been the Prime Minister of Poland back in 2007, before going on to become the President of the European Council in 2014, before leaving the role in 2019 and rejoining Polish politics back in 2021. So from a diplomatic perspective, he was always seen as a good European. Now, he wins the election at the end of 2023, but it was a highly contentious election, with the far-right parties making some serious gains in politics and serious accusations being thrown around by both sides in this fight. So can you take us through why this election was far more venomous than most Polish legislative elections tend to be?
The outgoing administration, Conservative Law and Justice government, PiS, led by Kaczynski, effectively manipulated state institutions, whether it was the central bank, whether it was compromising the judiciary, whether it was their control of the state media to tilt the playing field to their advantage. And despite those advantages they enjoyed as the incumbent, Tusk was able to mobilize public opinion and voters to secure a victory and a mandate to return Poland to the European mainstream. But there is a view in Brussels that Tusk's single biggest contribution to the EU will be the restoration of the rule of law and democracy back home. And for that reason, I think there's a lot of goodwill and support for what he's doing domestically.
Now, the relationship between Poland and the EU is somewhat of an odd one from an outsider's perspective. Poland, for instance, has been very critical of the EU, even going back as far as when they joined the organisation back in 2004, which does raise eyebrows in Brussels, as since that point they've received billions in grants and loans from the European Union, and nearly 80% of all of Poland's exports are being sold to other EU countries. In fact, quite a lot of Polish manufacturing is only made competitive by the fact that the EU puts large tariffs on many outside products. Yet, Warsaw for years has been openly criticising EU policy, as well as avoiding the adoption of the euro currency, maintaining the Polish zloty. Instead, from what we can see here, Poland quite often looks to more locally focused initiatives, like the 3 Cs initiative, for doing these kind of trade deals, and is always a bit apprehensive taking orders from Paris and Berlin. So can you take us through this dual dichotomy we see here, where Poland's economy is almost completely reliant and focused on exports toward the EU, but also harbours high levels of EU skepticism within the country?
That's a trend that I think you see in many countries. It's not unique to the UK and it's not unique to Poland. It's always easier for governments at the national level to blame their domestic challenges on faceless bureaucrats in Brussels that's unaccountable and doing lots of things that are inconsistent with the national interest. And we've had a peace administration in power for a long time that has been advancing and mobilising those arguments, making the case that what's happening in Brussels impinges upon national sovereignty, that decisions are being taken in the EU that disenfranchise local elites and the government. And you see that reflected in lots of different ways, whether it's Ukraine's access for goods to the single market, whether it's the enlargement perspective that would ultimately dilute the benefits Poland currently enjoys from the EU budget, whether it's a view that the EU has been too soft on Russia, whether it's some of the more integrative steps that the EU is taking, perhaps in the fields of economic or fiscal policy that countries feel impinges upon their national sovereignty. So you've had an equilibrium in Poland where the government has been making these arguments for a very long time, and that has created a degree of anti-EU opposition within Poland. There is also, of course, the historical context, the concern that Poland is subordinate to Germany. That is a very big fear that peace has absolutely capitalized upon, and even where Tusk has to be somewhat cautious. So there is a body of opinion that is anti-EU. It is fairly significant, and it is something that Tusk will have to manage.
So what changes has Tusk brought in so far? How does he compare to the previous administration?
If you look at some of the things that Tusk has been saying, you may be forgiven for thinking there's no change. Quite recently, Tusk has said he's not in the market for major reform of the EU to get it ready for Ukraine's accession. He has opposed Ukraine's access to this unilateral access to the single market, whether that be for grain or for goods or agricultural product. He has indicated opposition to the recent reform of the European Union's common asylum migration policy. If you take those things together, it paints a picture of a slightly less pro-EU leadership than many assume, or a leadership that is more constrained and quite worried about the way Europe plays domestically. What they're trying to do is constrain and contain this body of opinion that's quite Eurosceptic without feeding it too much. It's got to be about reinstituting an independent judiciary, about addressing the news and the information that a majority of the public has access to and is consuming, about ensuring that monetary policy isn't run for the purposes of the government in power, but for the interests of the broader macroeconomy.
Now, Tusk has been incredibly openly supportive of the war in Ukraine, and Poland since day one has been one of the largest contributors to the Ukrainian war effort out of any nation in Europe. And we even hear Tusk publicly stating that he wants to see Ukraine join the EU once this war is resolved. But in recent times, we've also seen large protests in Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary against Ukrainian EU membership, with 64% of Poles actually against the move, according to recent polling. Now, that doesn't mean they're against the war. Poland still has massive support of the war effort in Ukraine, but the reason that the majority of Poles are against EU membership for Ukraine is mostly an economic one. See, the main reason is that Poland's economy right now is largely being driven by manufacturing and agriculture being done in Poland to then be exported out into the EU. And this is being done here in Poland because Poles usually work longer hours and the labour cost is much lower than in Germany or France. But the labour cost has also been growing quickly in Poland, having risen nearly 50% since 2015, which has been great for the average Polish worker and great for the Polish economy overall, but it is also making Polish manufacturing less and less competitive. So many in Poland are worried that if Ukraine were to gain access to the EU, would push quite a lot of these companies operating in Poland to pick up their factories and then move them into Ukraine where labour is much, much cheaper. With this being one of the major criticisms being put forward by the truckers' protests in Poland. That because the EU is temporarily allowing Ukrainian truck drivers to operate within the EU without certain permits, that these cheaper to hire Ukrainians are taking Polish and Slovakian jobs, particularly in sectors like agriculture and transport. Now, to be fair, the EU will point out that many of these same arguments were made before the entry of Romania and Bulgaria into the European Union. But when we look at Romania and Bulgaria, even those two combined, population-wise, make up less than half of the Ukrainian population. And when speaking with a few people living in Poland at the moment, this is already somewhat of a sore spot for people living in major Polish cities, as Poland already has 1.5 million Ukrainians living within Poland at the moment, almost all of which fled into Poland as the war began in 2022. This massive and almost immediate influx of people into Poland has absolutely cattled the rental market across major cities in the country. So from speaking with policymakers within the EU, and from speaking with people who are living on the ground in Poland, I can see both sides of this argument. But without majority support within Poland itself, how would Tusk actually look to push this through? Surely for a man who's trying to walk this tight political line, he knows that this issue would be very easy to hijack for political opportunists.
It will not be easy, Ukraine's accession. There will be a lot of politics involved, as you suggest. Farmers in France, a massive and important constituency for any French president that will ultimately be hurt as a result of Ukraine's accession. There will be other countries in Central and Eastern Europe that do not want a country of Ukraine's size joining because of the impact it will have not only on budgets, but also the political and voting weight that Ukraine would enjoy if it were a member of the EU. And so this isn't going to be a straightforward process. There are a lot of politics involved. There will be a lot of challenges. But the point for today is Ukraine is on a process and on a trajectory to join. And a lot of the momentum behind that process is being driven by the war. At some point, the war will settle and some of the momentum will slow, and it will move into a regular enlargement process. So this is a long process. We're not talking short term. There will be lots of reforms that are needed to the EU to prepare for Ukraine's eventual accession. Not just that Ukraine will need to reform, become less corrupt, become more aligned with the EU's rules and its acquis communautaire, but also reforms within the EU to absorb such a large country and make sure it can still function, and that it isn't hijacked or overtaken, as we've seen has proven to be the case with whether it's Hungary or Slovakia and others. And so I don't think it's likely before 2030 at the earliest, but will probably be longer.
Well, keeping the conversation on Ukraine for a moment, where does Poland see its position on the western border of the country? That if the war continues to dig in or stagnate even further, or if we see Donald Trump win this year's election and call for an end to all US support and aid for the war, where would Poland see itself in this new European security dynamic?
It is very clear to us that he will demand, in exchange for America's commitment to European security, a significant investment in achievement of not only the NATO target, but probably beyond the NATO target, 2.5%. And so member states will scramble to meet that target. I think that Trump will be effectively signalling that its commitment to European security is transactional and depends upon this number being met. Now, Poland is already a key player in this regard to European defence. So it's not just about what Poland will do domestically, it's also about what the European Union will do collectively. And there is a lot of discussion in Brussels about Radek Sikorski, the current foreign minister, likely heading to Brussels as a European commissioner or as Poland's nominee to the College of Commissioners, with a view to assuming a big portfolio in Brussels, either related to defence, whether that's to do with procurement or adjacent to the single market, but basically addressing the question of the European defence industry, the need to consolidate it, the need to ensure that it can be ramped up and produce the kind of munitions that are needed, not only for Ukraine, but in a world and context, that is a lot more frightening and a lot more scary, and where the Europeans will need to be responsible for their own security because of the growing unreliability of the US.
So it's an interesting time for Polish politics. They finally get the EU back on side, but now have a population with serious economic concerns coming from east of the country. And no matter what happens in Ukraine, they're going to have to contend with the rearming Russia, sitting right there on its borders, either in Kaliningrad or within its partner, Belarus, who, as we've seen in 2022, is more than fine to be used as a launching point for other invasions. Brussels is also now putting out political spot fires right across the continent, and when looking toward the United States, at the moment it seems like a coin flip possibility of Trump re-entering the White House at the beginning of next year, which, if his rhetoric is to be taken seriously, would mean a cutting off of aid to Ukraine, effectively all but ending any chance of the Ukrainians continuing the war, forcing them to the table with Russia, and allowing Moscow to redeploy those troops elsewhere, whether that be to the Russian heartland, to the Far East, or even right on the Polish border. The nightmare scenario for Poland, though, is if we see Trump take the transactional route with Europe and NATO, using the same line that he was beginning to push at the end of his last presidency. The country should push to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, or they're out of NATO, which, when you actually look at the stats, is a pretty horrifying proposition, as it would see NATO shrink to just the US, Greece, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, the UK, and Croatia. If this rule were to ever come into play, NATO would have no Germany, no France, no Canada, no Turkey, and also, God forbid, no Luxembourg. And for Poland, looking at the UK, who's already in financial stress at the moment, and the US, who's increasingly focused toward Asia, Poland, in this nightmare scenario, would quickly see itself as a huge chunk of the entire European defense burden, having to take the threat of Russia and the defense of the Baltics almost entirely on its own shoulders. But does Poland have the capacity to take that on? Can Poland actually hold the European line on its own? And how likely is it that this nightmare scenario would actually come true? Well, to answer all that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. The dangers across the Dnieper.
The invasion of Ukraine was really a momentous moment for Poland. The war has come to our borders, Ukraine being just next door. So the prospect of having Russian tanks right on our borders is very real. So this year, Poland will reach over 4% of GDP on modernization and defense. So that's the big change. We also moved many of our units further east, and that's the element of national defense, where Poland is very active and extremely supportive of NATO's presence on the eastern flank. The phrase, not an inch of NATO territory will be threatened.
Michal Baranowski is the managing director of the German Marshall Fund of the United States East. And previously before that, he was a senior fellow and the director of the GMF's Warsaw office, where he provided overall strategic direction and leadership to the organization's work in Poland, the Baltic states, and the V4 countries. He writes and speaks extensively on NATO, transatlantic relations, and US foreign policy, and is a member of the Polish-German Reflection Group established by the presidents of Poland and Germany. So we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
Clearly, fortunately, we overestimated Russian forces, and Russia has overestimated their forces. Now, we cannot be relaxed for a very long time because Russia at the same time is rebuilding capabilities. So you have a race between Russia that has switched to a war footing, Russia that is trying to reconstitute its forces while it's fighting in Ukraine. And it's very clear that to avoid the fight in Poland, in the Baltic states, in Romania, we need to support Ukraine as long as it takes.
As we all watch Russia begin to rearm and increase its production capacity, Poland is taking its defense procurement very seriously, particularly after Poland gave away most of its Warsaw Pact kit to Ukraine in the earlier stages of the war. And now Poland has to effectively, somewhat, rebuild an entire set of kit from scratch. And whilst 2022 was a massive wake-up call for Poland and the rest of Europe, another big warning for Poland came back in 2021, where Polish war games being played out indicated that Poland would fall to Russia in just 5 days if Russia were to launch a full-scale invasion of Poland launched from Kaliningrad and Belarus. Now, I think it's safe to assume that the underlying math behind that war game has probably changed a little bit since 2021. having seen the Russian logistics in action with Ukraine. But nevertheless, the Polish are looking to spend an ungodly amount of money purchasing all sorts of top-tier equipment. As it stands today, just some of that shopping list includes hundreds of US-made M1 Abrams tanks. The Polish put an order in for 400 HIMARS systems, although we're told by the US that they couldn't fulfill the order for 400 of them, which for context, Ukraine currently has around 18. They also ordered 96 Apache helicopters, 8 Patriot batteries, frigates and submarines, and a whole lot of NATO standard small arms and other bits of kit. But Poland buying arms from the US isn't much of a story. What was the big story around this procurement buy-up was the massive amount of purchases Poland was making from the South Koreans, including hundreds of K2 Black Panther tanks, and over 200 Chunmoo launchers, and over 700 K9 self-propelled guns, with all of this coming on top of a bunch of F-35s from the US and some lighter fighter aircraft coming from the Koreans. This is an astounding amount of procurement, but what I want to figure out is why the pivot to the majority Korean equipment, as they're not only buying huge amounts of this stuff, but have also purchased a license to make K2s and K9s domestically within Poland, producing a Polish variant for use within the Polish armed forces and hopefully future export markets. That is a big, long-term vote of confidence in the Korean arms industry, and definitely raised some eyebrows within the German, French, and US defense sectors. So what prompted this call from Warsaw?
The reasons for the previous government to have made this decision were really twofold. One was availability. South Koreans, because they are in such a threatening environment, had tanks that were ready to go. They didn't have to change them, improve them. They were accessible. And the second reason that this transaction was a relatively good price. So that investment in modernization was aimed to get capabilities relatively quickly and relatively cheaply. The election brought a new team to power that is looking at all modernization decisions, including the South Korean purchase, to make sure that Poland, in fact, did get a good deal, that the financing is there, and ensure that there is the strategic dimension to this cooperation, because, of course, military purchases come with a deep strategic relationship. Perhaps that's where I would expect somewhat of a different view from the current government that will prioritize the relationship with the United States on one hand and with European partners, French you mentioned, but also Germany, Italy, Great Britain, when it comes to security and defense cooperation purchases.
However, it should be pointed out that most of these deals that were done with the South Koreans were done by the previous government, and were also done relatively quickly for a deal this size. And one of Peace's selling points around this deal was claims that the Koreans would be providing a lot of this kit to Poland with very cheap financing, so the Poles could pay it back with pretty good terms. But now with inflation much higher, and interest rates in South Korea being almost 3.5 times higher than where they were when the deal was signed, the Koreans in their statements now seem much more apprehensive about providing that finance, and recently have become increasingly fuzzy around some of the details here. And if those financing rates were to, let's say, change at the same rate that the South Korean interest rates are, that does set the stage for a very large defense budget blowout within the Polish government. So with this in mind, do you think this is a major concern of the government that's just come into power?
So the new government is in the process of doing a review of all the modernization deals, and the new team, minister and others made it very clear that agreements that have been signed and paid for will continue, will move forward. Not all of the conversations with South Korea are agreements that have been finalized. And the challenge before the broader strategic community here in Poland is that a lot of this agreement done by the previous government were not very transparent, including, for example, about the financing of the South Korean purchases. Those were never revealed to the public or to the opposition and current government. So based on this information, the new government will decide how to move forward on agreements that have not been finalized, as the ones that have been finalized are either here or will go forward soon.
So what was the thinking behind going down the very expensive route for this modernization program?
Part of the answer is that the threat that we are seeing in the region is deemed by really everyone across the political and strategic community very serious and persistent, with the war in Ukraine being the best example, but really not the only one. We remember very well the 2014 and 2008, the first invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and earlier Georgia. So there is no question that this is a persistent challenge here, and a very high.
The other thing that really had the defense community scratching their heads around these deals was the makeup of what was being purchased. As on one hand, Poland was buying all of this quite expensive top-tier equipment, to which a lot of that for a modernization program makes complete sense. And buying South Korean stuff also made some sense to a lot of people. The K9s, the South Korean self-propelled guns, for instance, actually probably had some good logic behind the decision to purchase them. As whilst they aren't fast-moving by any stretch of the imagination, they do have pretty good accuracy and a great rate of fire, which is pretty much exactly what you'd be looking for if you were expecting to fight off 600,000 poorly armed North Korean conscripts waddling across the DMZ at you. So I understand Warsaw's thinking here, as Poland at the time was probably thinking about large mass formations of Russians coming out of the west of Belarus. What I don't understand though is the other statements made by the government afterwards. Now obviously oversimplifying here for time, but as very basics, if you're going down that road of buying top-tier kits and very expensive equipment, you tend to do so whilst you're crafting a fully professional, very well-trained, elite army. So less men in the field, but each one of those men is holding a college education's worth of anti-tank weapons. So these purchases would make sense if Poland was looking to go down that route. However, Warsaw then came out after these purchases and claimed that they also wanted to increase the army's numbers from around 130,000 in the armed forces today to a whopping 350,000 in the armed forces by 2035, which is a massive increase. Now, by increasing your personnel to 350,000, it would make Poland the largest land power in Europe, but it would also see a massive part of their military budget every single year being eaten up by wages and personnel maintenance, leaving less and less for procurement and the upkeep costs of this very expensive equipment they've just purchased. It would lead to a kind of model where 300 soldiers may be sharing the same tank, but it is a very good tank. For the most part, modern armies tend to either be smaller, professional, well-armed units, or larger, less professional, and somewhat armed, much broader forces. But currently the Polish government is claiming that they want to be both. So how do you think Warsaw is actually intending to square this circle?
And you ask a good question about the model of the army. The previous government focused on the number of 300,000 soldiers. This has not been something that was clearly laid out into a plan. So I would not get too attached to that specific number by 2035.
Which is a big shift from what Poland has been saying for a while now. Now, 4% of GDP spending on defense is nothing to sneeze at, as 4% really does make Poland stand out amongst its European partners. Because if we look at the rest of Europe, and who else is hitting NATO's target of 2% of GDP being spent on defense, in Europe, all that's left would be the Baltics, who have tiny militaries themselves, Greece, who are probably more concerned about Turkey than Russia, Croatia, who are probably more concerned about Serbia than Russia, and the UK, who are probably hitting those targets largely due to cost overruns, legacy upkeep costs, and massive inflation and interest rates currently present within the UK defense sector. If Poland is looking to spend so much more money than most of its regional partners, do you think it's anticipating that it might have to take on a lot more of the Eastern European defense burden by itself?
Poland and few other frontline states are now carrying a burden of beefing up defense much faster than some of our other more Western European allies. We've been talking about the transatlantic burden sharing, Americans spending significantly more on defense than the European part of NATO. Well, we have now these discrepancies also within Europe, within the European part of NATO, but with a very sort of close neighbors. So I would expect that some of the costs of our defense will over time also become more Europeanized. Whoever is in power in Washington, D.C. will be approached by Polish government and other European government, pointing the strategic case for further support for Ukraine, not only when it comes to Ukraine itself, but when it comes to security of North Atlantic area and Article 5 allies. It's also clear to me that as time goes forward, goes on, and we can see this already with the discussion about aid for Ukraine in US Congress, that is a very difficult one. So as time goes forward, Europe will have to do even more, not only for its own defense, but also for support, both military and economic, of Ukraine. But here, it makes really no sense for countries that happen to be neighbors, but don't have necessarily the largest economy, to carry disproportionately high burden.
Well, if that doesn't work out, do you think Poland has the capacity to be able to ramp up its defense production to the levels they probably need?
We are in the beginning of this road. I mean, Poland has a robust defense industry, but there is much more of a potential. And again, because of how dangerous the neighborhood has become, it is clear that there will be need for much more capabilities, both in Poland and in the region. I am absolutely sure that Poland will be building up Polish capabilities with our, based on some very capable defense companies that we already have, but along with our partners, especially in Europe and the United States, that are willing to move into the neighborhood and share technology. We have been saying this for a very long time. I think now it's very clear, given the both war in Europe, in Ukraine, but also wars in Gaza, potential of a wider war in the Middle East, and also the tensions that we see in the Indo-Pacific. It is clear that Europe doesn't have the luxury to develop it slowly.
So what lies ahead for Poland? Are they really set to become the backbone of the European defense industry? Or were these just panic buys in a moment with an aggressive Russia, a Ukraine on the back foot, and a government seeking re-election? Will Poland follow through with this plan to become the powerhouse of Europe? And will Warsaw be able to drag some of their partners to modernize with them? What does the next year of politics and defense look like for the Polish state? Well, to take us through all that, we turn to our final guest.
Part 3. Berlin or Belgorod?
So I'd say that Poland has risen in prominence and in importance relative to other European allies in a highly significant way for several reasons. One, Poland was proven right by events because successive Polish governments for a number of years had been on the side of those NATO allies and EU member states who'd been warning about potential danger coming from Russia. I was a NATO official, so I attended a lot of meetings where diplomatic representatives from all the allied nations would have discussions about Ukraine, about Russia, about other issues. And what I observed in that period was that systematically Poland, the Baltic states, the Czech Republic, a few others would repeatedly be somewhat more pessimistic and giving stronger warnings about potential hostile intents on the part of Russia. And they were also all, including Poland, much more supportive of Ukraine as compared to certain other allies.
Edward Hunter Christie is a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And up until recently, he served as a senior NATO official, holding successive roles relating to defense economics, strategic foresight, and the alliance's technology policy, including his role as the deputy head of NATO's innovation unit and lead author of NATO's policy and white papers on artificial intelligence and on autonomous technologies. So we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
With the events in 2022, effectively, their very worst suspicions were proven true, whereas the somewhat more laid-back attitude of countries like France or Germany or Italy were clearly proven wrong.
How would you sum up Poland's reaction to the invasion of Ukraine? How has their policy changed, and what are the new goals going forward?
Poland was already complying in full, but as the war unfolded, Poland rapidly expanded its defense spending and also got into a process of expanding the size of its armed forces and ordering a lot of new defense equipment from a number of countries, including, for example, Korea. So everybody could see that Poland was really upping its game and becoming very serious. In addition to that, Poland's contribution was also very concrete because effectively it was, and still is, the most important Western neighbor of Ukraine, and it has served as the most important logistical conduit for Ukrainian civilians fleeing the war and for Western defense equipment and other assistance flowing into Ukraine. There are some flows through other routes, but the Poland route is the most important. And in addition, at least in the first several months of the war, by far the biggest number of Ukrainian refugees were in Poland. So Poland is by far and away the strategically most important country in Europe with respect to the Ukraine situation.
When looking at Poland these days, I'm seeing more and more references to Poland being regarded as the eastern shield of Europe. But having followed the situation very closely for years, how apt do you think that metaphor really is?
Poland is in the natural position of being the number one bulwark on NATO's eastern flank. A second natural one would be Romania, simply because they're the two largest countries in the region. But Poland is clearly number one. The war's been going on for 2 years. And Poland now is rather well equipped, and it is increasing its military capabilities. It is increasing its force size, and it is procuring a lot of the same kind of equipment that has proven successful in Ukraine, but it's procuring them in much bigger numbers. So if you think of multiple launch rocket systems like the HIMARS or more or less equivalent Korean systems, Poles are purchasing literally hundreds of those and hundreds of tanks and so on. And so we're very rapidly looking at Polish land forces that will probably be the strongest within NATO European allies. And if you like, the silver lining, if there is one at all, the silver lining to this war is that when you have a war of this magnitude on your doorstep, you study in great detail everything that's going on. You try to learn lessons. So all the military experts of Europe and North America and even beyond watching extremely closely everything that has happened. And the relationship with Ukraine being close, there's also a lot of exchange, not just public exchange, not just based on open source intelligence or independent experts, but obviously the military staffs themselves talking a lot and exchanging insights. And so I believe that, generally speaking, European armies and NATO armies, and the Polish army in particular, have learned a great deal about how Russia fights, how its way of war has evolved, how the Russians themselves have been learning lessons from this war.
Now, in the very early months of the 2022 invasion, Poland very rapidly gave away most of its old Warsaw Pact kit off to Ukraine so Ukraine could use it to fight the Russians off. But as soon as they donated all this gear, they needed to place orders for newer and far better kit in order to replace the ones they'd lost. Now, obviously the big story around these purchases is the fact that the Polish chose to get most of these purchases from South Korea, rather than from anyone within Europe. So why would Poland choose to purchase the majority of their kit from South Korea, as opposed to taking the advice of France or Germany and purchasing all of their gear from within Europe to further bolster the Europeans' defense industry?
If you're building a large land force, and if you're learning lessons from the Russia-Ukraine war, you're expecting a large-scale war that could last a certain amount of time and where the Russians could go all in with a lot of heavy equipment themselves. I suspect that it was a pragmatic decision first and foremost because speed was of the essence. And in my understanding, the Koreans were simply ready sooner. We have a lot of discussions nowadays in Europe about the moribund state of the European defense industrial base, which is beginning to pick up, and all sorts of initiatives and policies are being pushed forward. But I think the simplest explanation is simply that the Koreans were ready faster to provide at scale. Of course, the US is also going to be a supplier. So Poland, being the biggest buyer on NATO's eastern flank, shifting a fair chunk of its purchases to Korea, may even have done certain other eastern flank allies a favor, because it means that American industry will be able to supply across the board, including to Poland, but across the board.
So one of the questions that's always interested me around this topic is why Poland was chasing so many HIMARS systems in the early stages of this procurement, with Poland originally seeking to purchase around 400 to 500 HIMARS systems, before Washington eventually stepped in, thanked them for their enthusiasm and said no. Now, what confuses me about this is that yes, these HIMARS systems are absolutely amazing, and Ukraine is packing a serious punch with their 18 HIMARS systems. But if Ukraine can do all that with 18 systems, why was Poland originally looking to purchase 400 to 500 of these things before scaling it back down to around 100 units?
I can only speculate here, but I suspect that the assumption is simply that they looked at how effective the HIMARS were inside Ukraine, and they simply wargamed having a much larger number of them, and imagined that they could basically take out a considerably larger or very large Russian forces without coming at such close range to Russian artillery. In other words, it would be a somewhat costly but nonetheless effective way of basically demolishing advancing Russian formations without getting too close to the Russian artillery range. That would mean less losses and less casualties, but more expensive because you're expending a more expensive ordnance, the gimlers that are used in the HIMARS. I would suspect that that's the rough calculation.
So from some accounts, what largely saved Ukraine in those early stages of the 2022 offensive was the fact that nations like Czechia, Romania, and Slovakia, as well as most notably Poland, quickly ran down to their old bunkers, scooped up all their old Warsaw Pact kit and munitions that they still had lying around from the end of the Cold War, and sent it all directly to Ukraine to keep their soldiers supplied. This move being an absolute game changer at the time. But here's the thing, it's a great move, but it's a move you can really only do once. And now all those old Soviet bunkers are sitting empty, and the gear they're refilling those bunkers with isn't Warsaw Pact kit either. Particularly in the case of Poland, the types of gear they're looking to replace that with are very expensive brand new NATO grade kit, paid for by the Polish taxpayers at quite a high price. And theoretically, with that in mind, let's say we were to see another Russian invasion of a non-NATO state like Moldova or Georgia, where Russia crossed the border, and the ability to resupply those countries in those first crucial days may make or break the war there. Putting Poland in that situation today, do you think they would be willing to either A, give away their new stuff that they just purchased at a very, very high price, or B, have their defense production underway enough that they might be able to ramp up production to provide a steady supply of munitions and weapons to these countries in the event that they really desperately need it? Does Poland have the capacity to be the savior of the day again if we see another Russian invasion of a neighboring state?
Obviously, that becomes increasingly possible over time once Poland feels confident that it has what it needs to withstand a large-scale Russian attack. It could feel that it could afford to transfer some of these new NATO standard equipments to other countries in need, including possibly Ukraine in future if the current war continues or if there's a hiatus and then the war resumes. So it opens up many possibilities. And I think that it is a possibility that Polish, Korean multiple launch rocket systems or Korean tanks that the Poles are procuring could in future end up in a third country defending itself against Russia. That's a distinct possibility. After all, we have plenty of precedent for that happening right now. So who knows in 3 years or 5 years if we still have the sorts of conditions we have now somewhere in Eastern Europe or the Caucasus, that's possible.
Well, the big question hanging over the war in Ukraine today is almost certainly the future of US funding. That if the House doesn't pass a Ukraine funding bill, or a potential future president decides that he'll cut off all funding to Ukraine, would Poland have the capacity to fill that gap left by the US? Or at that point, would Poland more likely just cut its losses and start beefing up the defense on its own borders?
That may be one of the most sensitive questions one could possibly ask, and it's really, really hard to tell. I would not rule it out, but it's a complicated choice, in a sense, a devil's dance, if you will. Because there's probably a number of decision makers in Poland, also in the Baltics and a few other countries, who would not have objected if the West had actually intervened in the war, to simply just defeat the Russians outright, fast, do the job, throw them out, take the risk, of course, of a wider war, but probably defeat the Russians. Once everybody saw that the Russians were not able to overwhelm Ukraine, that the war was lasting longer, that Russia had made nuclear signals, but they weren't actually using nuclear weapons. Once people saw that Russia could take enormous losses and somehow not really escalate, the whole perception of the escalation risk changed quite strongly, especially for Eastern flank countries, although it did not change much in Berlin, Paris, Washington, and to some extent London. So that's an interesting split. So now the hard question is this. The key reason why you would not do that is because for your own national security and territorial integrity, you're counting on NATO and you're counting on the United States. If the United States privately signals to you, listen, you don't cross that border, you don't enter that war, because otherwise then I'll drop you and you'll be on your own. However, if Warsaw were then to start to believe that actually the American guarantee isn't so solid anymore, that would mean America not just dropping Ukraine, but also casting doubt on whether it would protect Poland. If it were to go all the way to that extremity, then I think you could imagine a different calculus in Warsaw. I mean, it would be cataclysmic. But if the Poles themselves were to begin to doubt America's reliability, that could take us in a completely new world and a rather dangerous and unpredictable one, because indeed, all of a sudden, there would be an incentive for Poland to make common cause with Ukraine much more strongly. So that question is probably one of the most delicate that political leaders need to think about. If America somehow signals to the Eastern flank nations that they will not necessarily be protected, this could have cataclysmic effects and very hard to predict, because it could be that the Eastern flank nations very regrettably in their hearts basically tell the Ukrainians, sorry guys, you really are on your own. we just can't do this anymore because nobody is backing you anymore. Or they could double down on their efforts, but on existing efforts and just supply even more to the Ukrainians and hope for the best. Or they could actually flip all over to the other side if they feel that America no longer has Poland's back. So that would be an absolute worst case scenario. I don't think it's very likely. I don't think even a Trump presidency would dare do that. And I think a Trump presidency would probably be more cynical and more calculating. They would probably really try to drop only Ukraine and not drop anybody else, because dropping more than Ukraine would just be not sustainable. It would damage American credibility and power and influence too much. But just dropping Ukraine would be the cynical in-between path. And then that will, of course, put the Europeans on the spot, and it's creating enormous difficulties. In this kind of situation, we also know from history, for example, in the early phases of the Second World War, where effectively you have a domino effect. If a major foe is rising and beginning to attack one country after the other, a country that is not immediately being threatened has a very difficult choice to make. How much of your capabilities and your armaments do you keep at home for your own defense in case you're directly attacked, and how much do you give to your ally who's actually fighting? There were very difficult decisions and even some historical resentment on the side of the French, for example, regarding how much the UK, how much Britain had given to France in 1940, and how quickly the Brits had given up and left through Dunkirk. So you really can have this situation where, on paper, an alliance of states is stronger and they ought to prevail on paper. But if somehow they are split, and if somehow they each start to compute their chances of survival completely individually, and they give up on having a calculus based on their combined force, then that can yield a very catastrophic domino effect. And then an aggressor who is only medium-sized, shall we say, can actually prevail against one smaller opponent after another smaller opponent after another smaller opponent.
Prior to the 2022 offensive, we were seeing growing loggerheads between Brussels and the government in Warsaw, with Poland even being threatened that they may be kicked from the European Union, or even become a pariah state in their own right for what the government was trying to carry out domestically. Now, I understand that Tusk is in power right now, and that he has a much better relationship with the European Union. But what happens when the opposition party, PiS, returns? If Poland goes back to the sort of behaviour that they were carrying out prior to the 2022 invasion, will the EU actually be willing to call it out like they did beforehand? Or frankly, by then, with Poland being such an important part of European defence, is Brussels simply more likely to just overlook their domestic actions, in the same way that arguably NATO tends to overlook a lot of Turkey's domestic actions at the moment due to their geographic position? With Poland becoming the eastern shield of the European Union, does it run the risk of removing Brussels' ability to credibly criticise Warsaw for its domestic actions?
If one just goes back slightly in time, it is true that the PIS government of Morawiecki still had this headbutting with EU institutions and with a certain number of EU member states in Western Europe about rule of law issues, about the judicial system, the court system, etc., the appointment of judges, also some issues to do with the public broadcaster and a few other issues. So those issues were there, but the criticism was muted, I think rightly, on very pragmatic grounds, because Poland has become a net positive security provider to Europe. And by the way, it was also one of the countries training Ukraine's armed forces in the period prior to 2022, and also supplying weapons even before the war started. That was one thing. But Poland also scored a lot of points behind the scenes because they had such an effective and strong response to Lukashenko's hybrid attack on Poland using displaced migrants from the Middle East. If your listeners recall, basically Lukashenko flew in people from Syria and Iraq and a few other countries who were interested in being economic migrants to Europe. He flew them to Belarus with the promise that basically they would be pushed across the border, and then they're in Poland, and then they can go wherever they want, presumably Germany, Sweden, or countries like that. And the Belarusian state basically gathered huge numbers of these people and started pushing them towards the Polish border in a genuine hybrid attack, because these waves of people were basically being pushed forward, were being egged on by Belarusian state security officers who were also harassing the Polish border guards using things like blinding lasers. I mean, it's just incredible what they were doing. And that was in 2021. And Poland basically shut its border, prevented these waves from coming in, and was very, very strict, basically had an extremely secure border control operation. And not everybody wanted to say it too loud, but in Germany, France, and in Brussels, people were incredibly grateful for Poland having managed to do that. So Poland really gained in credibility and in strategic importance completely objectively. And that's why I think the criticism on the rule of law issues, they didn't go away, but they were much more muted because, well, the house was on fire. And here we have a colleague who's reliable. In addition to all of that, now that Donald Tusk is the prime minister, and of course he's very well regarded in Western Europe, very well regarded in Germany. He used to run the EPP, so that's the parliamentary group of the European People's Party, so the center-right party, which is the same as the German CDU. Tusk has these excellent relations with countries further west, and he has made commitments to carry out certain reforms to bring Poland in line with EU requirements. And there's a lot of trust in him that he will do just that. So it's going to be a process, but I think that Poland, first of all, will receive the EU funds that had been frozen. The one that's really losing out of the situation now is Hungary, because now Hungary, under the Orbán government, they're the ones who are now much more isolated. It used to be the case that even though the PIS government in Poland strongly disagreed with Hungary on its policy towards Ukraine, nevertheless, the old government PIS were still giving political cover to Orbán. Now, with Tusk in power, it's very different. Tusk is already on the record publicly talking about Orbán fatigue as opposed to Ukraine fatigue. So we're going to see the walls closing down on Orbán. How easy that is to do, that's another matter. But the point is that this whole game has shifted, and now Poland is with the other EU states, and the one that's really in isolation is Hungary.
So staying on Hungary and the EU for a minute, another question that's being raised at the moment is around Poland's attitudes towards EU expansion. Now, Polish opinion polls show that around 64% of Poles actually do not want to see Ukraine entering the European Union, largely due to economic considerations. And this is where one of the problems lies. As for Ukraine to get back on their feet after having so much of their country devastated, joining the European Union would be a fast track to getting money, jobs, and development into the country to put them back on their feet. But by inviting Ukraine into the European Union, without Kiev having full control over the country's 1991 borders, it would on day one introduce some pretty tricky mutual defense questions into the mix, let alone all the other economic issues that manufacturing and export-reliant states like Romania and Poland would have going into the expansion. But even looking away from Ukraine for a minute, within the EU, Poland is a net beneficiary state, meaning that they take in more money from the EU than they give out, both through businesses taking advantage of the cheap labour in Poland and setting up factories within the country, and also through EU development funding. And if the EU were to expand to Ukraine or the Balkans, it would mean spreading that development funding much thinner, and therefore less money for Poland. And in the case of Ukraine and some of these Balkan countries, inviting them into the EU also adds other potential flashpoints, which have the potential to spill over into market instability or drag in other European powers. So how do you think Poland will look to approach the issue of EU enlargement going forward? Do you think they'll push ahead looking at the long-term vision for the continent, even if it means short-term pain for many sectors of the economy? Do you think we might see politicians outright oppose it for quick political gain? Or do you think there's a middle ground where someone like Tusk would vocally call for and support Ukraine's ascension into the EU, whilst also quietly behind the scenes actually leaning on Hungary, Slovakia or Spain to block their path into the European Union? What do you think Poland's attitudes towards European expansion will be going forward?
That's an excellent question. I think you've really put your finger on the real world difficulty. So, of course, at a political and strategic level, Poland is very sympathetic to Ukraine being in NATO and in the European Union. It's sympathetic to both trajectories, as are most of the other countries in Central Europe. So it remains the case that Poland is in the bloc of Ukraine-friendly countries, including on those two questions, both NATO membership and EU membership. However, there is a challenge of certain specific sectors of the Polish economy, most notably the agricultural sector, and there's also some conflicts to do with truckers, with road transporters. And this has sort of taken a life of its own within Polish politics, which is a potential attack surface for covert Russian influence operations and propaganda. But that is not to say that the feelings of the Polish farmers and Polish road transporters are not real. They are real. They are, of course, afraid for their income. They're afraid of the competition coming from Ukraine. Prior to the war, Ukraine had a different pattern and different routes for its exports, a lot going by sea. It was not putting large volumes of grain and other produce onto the EU market, because the EU market for food products and agricultural products was not especially open to Ukraine. Ukraine is a competitive producer, pre-war, it was exporting all over the world, a major grain producer and exporter. As a result of the war, a lot was redirected through Poland, Romania, and other neighboring countries. And there was leakage onto the market. It distorted the market. And this also has created tensions between Poland and countries further west, and even the EU institutions. The EU institutions believed that the EU market could just absorb it all, and perhaps underestimated the asymmetrical nature of the market shock, because of course farmers in France don't get to feel much the penetration of, or the leakage of some Ukrainian grain into the Polish market. But for Polish farmers, it's a slightly different story. It's also very difficult to discuss these issues because there's a lack of good data, and perhaps even a lack of proper attention, dare I say, on the part even of the European Commission. And for the European Union, when it negotiates an accession deal, there's also been calculations that, according to which, for the European Union's regional support funds, Ukraine would basically end up getting almost all of them if it were a member today. And so you have countries and regions in the eastern parts of the European Union, which are currently the lower income regions. They get a fair chunk of structural funds and regional funds from the EU budget. They would no longer get them, or they would get a lot less. So the whole game of incentives and how to share the cake is going to be on the table.
I want to finish this interview today by talking about something a Polish friend described to me. A lot of people in the country feel like Poland has really two paths forward. One, heading westward, to try and integrate further into the EU. For Poland to try and sit at the big kids' table with France and Germany, hoping that those two will show them the respect that Poland probably deserves. Or two, to look to the east of Europe and become the bigger fish in the smaller pond. That while still staying within the European Union, Poland would look to tighten its relations with other states within the east of the Union. States like Hungary, Slovakia, Czechia, Romania, Bulgaria, and the Baltics, hoping to potentially lead this group as a bit of a voting bloc within the EU system, that France and Germany would have to come to Poland in search of approval from the East. Looking at those two paths forward, which one do you see is more likely for Poland to take? Do you think that they'll look to be the little fish in the western pond, or the bigger fish in the eastern one?
I think the game is open. Certainly under the PIS leadership, it was clear that Poland's strategy was to try to federate the nations of Central and Eastern Europe. Poland was very active in promoting what's called the Three Seas Initiative, and also separately a grouping called the Bucharest Nine. Three Seas Initiative is more about sort of strategic economic questions and infrastructure and energy and things of that nature. And Three Seas, it's called that because it's the countries that connect the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the Adriatic. So basically the whole of Central and Eastern Europe. But the Bucharest Nine grouping, which is a separate thing, and those are basically the 9 states of the Eastern flank, roughly speaking. It's sort of an informal mini NATO within NATO. I don't want to exaggerate that, but the point is that it's meetings of the foreign ministers and defense ministers of those 9 countries to coordinate positions. And obviously, you can feel the effect within NATO meetings when you've got all of the 9, or possibly the 9 minus Hungary, saying almost exactly the same thing at the table in both institutions. Well, it's because they coordinate a lot and they have common interests. And key to their common interests is, again, solidarity with Ukraine, opposition to Russia, more strongly than feelings in France, Italy, or countries like that. So I think that's not going to stop. I don't think that the Tusk government would stop that. But at the same time, everybody also expects Tusk, given who he is and given the nature of his political platform, to reach out to Germany considerably more. That's always been part of the Tusk approach, and also of Radoslaw Sikorski, who's the foreign minister now and was the foreign minister under the older Tusk government some years ago. On the defense policy side, Poland was much more interested in investing in the relationship directly with the United States, as I mentioned before, to try to bind the United States bilaterally, not just through NATO, but bilaterally to the defense of Poland. That's very important. I also do not see Tusk going against that. So I think now what we're looking at might be a partial rebalancing. So I think that probably Poland will seek to keep its strong investment in having good relations across the region and of trying to federate views across Eastern Europe. I think they'll continue to do that, and they will continue to try to keep America in. But the rebalancing going forward will see Poland investing a lot more in the bilateral relationship with Germany and talking with Germany with a lot more trust and a lot more intimacy. So I think that the Poles have made possibly the best set of investments that one could make in that position.
Poland right now is sitting in an odd place in history, facing a whole slew of brand new issues, whilst facing others that Joseph Pilsudski would have also faced staring down the Vistula 100 years ago. Poland finds itself as a country trying to assert itself as a manufacturing power within Europe, and to be fair, right now they really are, even growing to a point where we're seeing numerous stories coming out over the last few months outlining how Poland will overtake the UK in wealth by 2035. Although, to be fair, some of the underlying economic modelling behind that piece is a little simplistic. But regardless of which, Warsaw is now barreling towards a classic middle income trap, where it either breaks through the ceiling and joins the status of high income nations like Germany, France, and Sweden, or otherwise enter a depressing cycle that we see right across the globe, where the country becomes richer, the people become better off, and the price of labour goes up. Then factories relocate elsewhere, unemployment rises in the country, wages then drop back down to what they were beforehand, and the factories then return to the country, beginning the whole process over and over again. Poland now needs to figure out whether it can break out of that middle income trap and become the rich nation it wants to be, or whether the country is just entering this well-trodden cycle. Defense-wise though, the story seems to be a bit brighter, with Poland making various deals with the US and South Korea that would place Poland as the premier land power within Europe, that along the borders of Kaliningrad and Belarus will stand some of the most fearsome weapons tested to date. But in reality, the closer we look at those deals, the more holes begin to appear in them. And even Poland's own command structure can't seem to fully decide what sort of army they want to have going into the future. But seemingly none of that matters, because European leaders are now worried about a brand new issue for the continent, speculating about what might happen if the US either pushes NATO to pony up and hit its 2% goals, or simply has a president that might pull out of the alliance altogether. A understandably worrying sentiment for the French and the Germans, but an absolutely terrifying one for the Baltics and Poland, many of whom still have citizens with first-hand memories of the last time Moscow was left unchecked in this region of the world. Europe seems to be placing its bets that the Polish will be able to meet the gap. However, it should really be pointed out that this reliance on Poland is probably going to make some in Brussels a little bit uncomfortable, as again, Poland was a nation just a few years ago the EU was threatening to kick out of the Union, and until recently was openly withholding funds from. If the EU does decide to push forward on this plan, the organisation is rolling the dice that any time in the near future, Poland doesn't elect its own Orban or Erdogan, who doesn't have the European project in mind. I mean, just take a minute and think about how Europe would look today if Orban was in charge of the entire alliance's eastern flank. And that's a slightly concerning premise to think about. But in classic Brussels style, that's a problem for down the road. For now, the US is keeping the war effort in Ukraine afloat. Poland is still boasting about its new procurements, and the pro-EU Tusk is running the show in Warsaw. So, nothing to worry about. However, here's the thing about Polish history, because as the history shows us, in Poland, the situation never stays the same for very long. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week. If you can't tell, I always enjoy doing these episodes about Eastern Europe. However, by now, if you're a regular listener to the show, you might have noticed that this episode came out a little later than it usually does, on a Friday of all things. Well, that's because we've been trying out a few new launch days for the show, and trying to see what might sit best with you guys. So now that we've released some episodes on a Monday and a Tuesday and a Wednesday and now a Friday, feel free to let us know which day of the week seemed to suit you best, and we can then lock that in, and then get back to our usually rigid scheduling. But for now, thanks for your patience without testing the dates on this one, and admittedly, it has been nice to see so many people either emailing or texting me asking where this week's episode of the show is. The good thing though is that if you had gone looking for the show on one of the other days this week and not found anything new there, you could have instead popped over to our sister channel where we did have new content just recently dropping, that channel being Context Matters, where we just dropped an entire video unpacking Viktor Orban's rise to power in Hungary. So feel free to go check that out once you've wrapped up here. Now, if you want to be made aware of when we do move episode release dates or when we might be dropping some brand new content, you can find all of our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeElliottOz. Oz is in Australia. This show is completely funded by our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each month to help myself and the team keep this show going. And speaking of our amazing Patreons, this week I'd like to thank Luke Heckman, Joseph R. Hungerford, Toby Partridge, Jack Hyman, Nyan Little, Isaiah Santillana, Sydney Paris, and Naja Nick, who are the latest patrons to sign up or increase their donations as of the time of recording. This show is only possible with the support of listeners like this, whose donations each month help keep this show going, and we cannot thank them enough for all of their support here on the show. So if you feel you have a couple of dollars you could spare, and you want special access to content like our recent workshop unpacking Taiwan's invasion plans, or next week's upcoming live analysis for the Soviet invasion plans for Europe, you can sign up on our Patreon page today, links for which are in the description. But for now, this episode on Poland is all thanks to you guys. Now moving on, as usual, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first is White Eagle, Red Star by Norman Davies, for a full history of the Polish-Soviet War we were discussing in the opening of this piece. The second is A Covert Action, Reagan, the CIA, and the Cold War Struggle in Poland, by friend of the show Seth G. Jones, for a look at the internal politics of Cold War Poland. And the third is The New Politics of Poland, A Case of Post-Traumatic Sovereignty by Yaroslav Kuzic, for a look at the modern state of Polish politics. I want to say a big thanks to this week's guests, Mujtaba Rahman, Mikhail Baranovsky, and Edward Hunter. It was absolutely amazing to have you on the show this week. Now, this episode was also the beginning of a new cycle of episodes, which usually means a lot of crunch work for the team. So I'd like to give an additional thanks to the primary researchers of this piece, that being Nate Ostilla, Lorenz van Kielbilk, Jamie Tanu, Daniela Givella, and Genevieve Dodland-May. I'd also like to thank the rest of my staff, being Cameron Gale, the producer, Perry Grace, Daniela Givella, Genevieve Dodland-May, Nate Ostilla, Nick McNally, Sean Cottalem, Isaac Gibbs, Andrew Garbery, Scott Missler-Ferguson, Jemima Pentreath, Ben Nutter, Mason Wise, Gabriel Lane, Lorenz van Kierbilk, and Robbie Sutton, our research assistants and writers, Raul Devanarayanan, our OSIN analyst, Francis Leach, our director of breaking news, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Kashyap Maheshwari and Alexander Woolgarden from our online team, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. As always, I can't thank this team enough for all their work they put into the show. And lastly, The Red Line will be back in a fortnight with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.